What is the problem with cultural appropriation? I don't think it's inherently a bad thing, but it's good to talk about it so that we have the language to criticize those instances where it can be. A lot of Buddhist iconography, for example, is often appropriated for marketing. Think just about any brand with Zen in the title, proliferating a lot of misunderstandings about Buddhism in the West. These misunderstandings can manifest as little errors, like using nirvana and heaven interchangeably, but it can maybe lead to others as well. Myanmar's human rights abuses against the Rohingya have actually been documented for years, but I think they only became front-page news to Western audience very recently because for a while we assumed Buddhist populations must all have the sort of calm, peaceful outlook that our marketed fantasy of them has made. On a less directly harmful level, I think there's some understandable resentment by once foreign minority groups in the West when some part of their culture that's very important or even sacred to them becomes a passing fad for the population as a whole with little to no respect for that sanctity. There is appropriation, misappropriation, and malappropriation. Some people argue that in its most basic sense, the concept of cultural appropriation is essentially meaningless since all cultures are, and have always been, a product of mixing and transforming. When people talk about cultural appropriation, they are most likely referring to either misappropriation or malappropriation, which both are seen as harmful to the cultures or people of the cultures from which they take, either by defaming or profiting from these aspects, among other things. Usually, these types of appropriation are made possible through a significant power imbalance between the two groups of people. So when a cultural group of great power that already has a history of damaging another cultural group in significant and possibly devastating ways cherry-picks aspects of the victim culture whilst leaving the people and societies responsible for creating them in a wake of ruin, it functions more like cultural pillaging than organic integration. TLDR, cultures mix and fuse no matter what, but there are problematic instances of cultural appropriation generally accompanied by a precedent of exploitation and power imbalances. My main problem with the concept of cultural appropriation is that it helps perpetuate the idea that people can be neatly divided into homogeneous and separate cultures. You are Chinese and do Chinese things, I am Spanish and do Spanish things. However well-intentioned this might start out, in the end it unwittingly paves the road to racism and xenophobia. While it is true that there may be problems when people use and adapt elements from other cultures, I find that the concept of cultural appropriation tends to be too broad and ill-defined to be useful. Instead, we should be looking at concepts like cultural disrespect, taking elements of somebody else's culture in a way that insults or demeans them, or cultural exploitation. Elvis Presley became immensely rich and famous, but the black musicians that inspired his music and wrote his songs died in poverty. I think there is inappropriate cultural appropriation. Old white guy here. Example. Wearing an eagle feather American native headdress. It's a bozo no-no. For starters, it's patronizing. Then, only the chief could ever wear it, sometimes only if he hunted the eagle himself. It's a solid no. But sometimes I might show my love and appreciation of a culture by doing/eating/singing something that is classic to another ethnic group. I think that should be recognized for the honest tribute it is. Read through some of these answers, and I don't think any of them touch on the actual reasons behind people getting upset over certain instances of cultural appropriation, so I'll give my take on it too. No one thinks that enjoying any aspect of any culture that isn't specifically your own is appropriation. Rather, it becomes appropriation in specific instances, and those instances seem to fall into two different categories. Case 1. The person appropriating the relevant piece of culture undermines or completely lacks the knowledge to understand its importance, reducing millennia-old tradition to something like a fashion statement. Example, people wearing indigenous American headdresses. This is problematic because headdresses are something that are earned in a sense. They are given to respected members of the community and are an important part of American indigenous culture and history. Another example, tourists getting Buddha heads as tattoos. They don't really understand its significance and have no personal stake in Buddhism, and because of this they, whether on purpose or not, neglect to consider how this comes off for devout Buddhists. In both cases the issue is primarily ignorance and the downplaying of important parts of cultures that are not your own. Case 2. The person appropriating the piece of culture benefits from this appropriation where the people for whom the culture is tied to their history do not. Example, dreadlocks. Dreadlocks have a long history, but are culturally attributed primarily to black people. The unfortunate reality is also that black people in white societies have historically been looked down upon for having dreads, with the dominating perspective being that they were unclean, unhygienic, etc. However, once dreads became fashionable amongst white people, those same white people did not have to experience the same ostracism that black people did. Another example, Indigenous American dream catchers. With the history of genocide inflicted on Indigenous Americans, it seems like extra salt in the wound to have a company with no ties to the Indigenous communities mass-producing dream catchers. That piece of their culture is lifted and used for profit while their own communities struggle even today with getting access to food, water, and medical supplies. In both of the above situations, non-members of the culture use something they lift from the culture as a way of attaining capital, whether social or economic. The actual members of that culture, the ones for whom their culture is an identifying part of their history, do not benefit from this, and are in fact often denigrated while their white counterparts are able to get away with cherry-picking parts of their culture for novelty. Overall, I think the derision on Reddit towards cultural appropriation is silly, and people often fail at understanding the difference between cultural appropriation and appreciation. No one says white people can't enjoy parts of other cultures. The perspective is rather that different cultures deserve respect, and that to appropriately enjoy parts of various cultures, one must be sensitive to the opinions of the people to whom that culture belongs. TLDR. Cultural appropriation consists of either cherry-picking parts of specific cultures for novelty or enjoying the benefits of the product of a specific culture while the originators of the culture fail to benefit and are often viewed with derision. It is important to treat various cultures and the people within them with respect. Much of culture is intended to be shared, but some parts are not. One must recognize that some parts of a culture are extremely important to the people born into it, and it's important to take that into account. I think that cultural appropriation is used overly broadly over things that are not that big of a deal, but there are valid call-outs of cultural appropriation. Here's an example of what I think is icky about cultural appropriation. Imagine that something from your culture was seen as ugly. As a specific example, we'll use black hairstyles, such as dreadlocks. Black people face some levels of cultural discrimination around their hairstyles. They may be asked to straighten their hair as it might be seen as unprofessional, despite the fact that it's their natural hairstyle, or cultural standards might declare their hair to be ugly/unattractive. Black women have the hardest time on OkCupid. Asian men are in a similar position. Now imagine if dreadlocks became trendy among white people. The same hairstyle that was a target of discrimination for you, and that you were made fun of up until this point, is now a fashion trend. You may even see people who once made fun of you sporting that same hairstyle. It's a bit dramatized, but hopefully you get why cultural appropriation feels bad if you face discrimination for it. There's a difference between truly trying to understand another culture and then borrowing things from that culture respectfully, and just taking things that look cool without respect for the source. I don't think that this is a good reason to label everything that's borrowed from another group cultural appropriation, but there is a valid emotion underneath it all.